Awesome. So again, welcome everyone. So glad that you're here today. In the chat, you'll see a link for our landing page today, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see what we're talking about here. This is really just our home base for everything as we engage in today's session. And I always give the disclaimer, I'm an elementary teacher by trade and by passion. So if I ask for thumbs up, I just can't help it. We just go with it naturally. So if you could give me a thumbs up if you're looking at our Educating for American Democracy right now, big on the screen. Awesome. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Thank you so much. So on this landing page for today, you'll find our slides. We always know sometimes it's nice to have the slides with you so you can go back, relook at things. That's embedded right there on the slides for today, on the site for today. And take a moment and let's do some welcome introductions. If you can go ahead, I see some of you putting yourself in the chat. We also have an amazing map. As we think of this project Educating for American Democracy, we've really been engaging people from across the country, which has been so exciting. So if you can, go ahead, add yourself to the map. And if you're back for a second, third, fourth time, we're so excited that you're here again. You know how this goes, but you can change your color on the map. But what you're going to do is you're actually going to tap the plus sign in the top corner of the map, tag your location, and then we're going to see our map continue to populate. I will say, if you have any friends that are in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, we need to get them into these sessions. We have a little empty space over there on our map. So go ahead and add yourself and your location to your map just to kind of be part of this story that we're putting together with Educating for American Democracy. And also, many of you have introduced yourself in the chat. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself on the Padlet again, too, you're going to do the same thing. Just add the plus sign. I will say part of the reason that we have a lot of Padlets in our session is that way you can go back and see. We know sometimes conversation sparks and you just start going really fast. And sometimes you want to go back and reread what someone said without having to scroll endlessly. So we do have our Padlet for today, but I will say this space is really for you to do some thinking, some reflection. So feel free to use it as much or as little as you'd like. Additionally, those of you who are back again, tell us, how have you been bringing EAD to the classroom? How have you been bringing the concepts and ideas, whether it's about the EAD roadmap or some of the amazing work of the institutions that we've been bringing to our conversations. So please feel free to share your thoughts there. And what you'll see is in today's conversation, we'll continue going, and you still have that space to stop, think, reflect as you're hearing the rest of the conversation. So please do not worry if you need to take an extra moment to share any thoughts or ideas. And my colleagues will keep putting that link into the chat, so do not worry. They will keep dropping that in. Thank you, Jillian, and thank you, Michael. So just shared our site for today. Now, a couple of housekeeping pieces. If you need documentation for today's webinar, make sure that you're completing the Padlets and also make sure that you complete the exit ticket at the end of the session. We do have so many of you who have been doing such a wonderful job of participating in multiple sessions, and definitely completing those exit tickets each time is amazing and helpful. And it also helps us improve these sessions to make sure we're meeting your needs. And if you love social media and you're hearing some insightful elements from our teachers, from our organization experts, feel free to share it on #EAD Roadmap and to follow us on Twitter. Just continue to share the story and to share the conversation that we're having today. And on that note, I'm going to jump right in. I know that some of you are brand new to the roadmap, and then there are some of you who have been coming to several of these sessions. So on one hand, this is a review for some of you. On the other hand, this is an introduction for another portion of you. So we'll go a little slow today through this first section, but also know that you always have the opportunity to go back, rewatch the session, and explore more of the Educating for American Democracy website. So that is always available, and we'll continue sending you those video links so that you can catch up if you didn't get to watch any of the, or watch or participate in any of the earlier sessions. So as we start today, lots of you are like, EAD, what's EAD? Educating for American Democracy. So as we talk about this conversation today, just reminding us that it's funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Department of Education, and it's led by Circle, iCivics, the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, and the Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. Now, we had all of these amazing experts, but the other piece that was amazing about this project is we had a cross-ideological team of experts, historians, political scientists, and educators in this conversation, over 300 contributors. So that's part of this, the passion and the design of this work. When we think about what the EAD roadmap is, the EAD roadmap is an inquiry-based content framework that provides guidance for excellence in civics and history education for all learners. Yet, since the roadmap is a framework and is not a curriculum or a mandate, it provides states and districts flexibility to use the roadmap to deliver excellent history and civic learning that leans into essential discussions around topics like reflective patriotism. It also encourages a telling of America's plural yet shared narrative and accounting of the past that's both positive and negative, thinking about how are we balancing the good and the bad in those points of tension. When we talk about EAD, you'll also see that we have 3 core documents. We have our EAD report. The EAD report contains the theory, rationale, and approach to the roadmap. The EAD roadmap itself contains 7 themes across 4 grade levels. And then finally, we have our pedagogy companion, which describes the 6 core pedagogical principles. Now, today's session, we are diving into theme 3. In our previous sessions, we have focused on theme 1, theme 2, an EAD overview. Today, we're diving in deeper into theme 3. So as we dive into this roadmap, first, I just want to remind us of the structures of the roadmap. So at the core of the roadmap, we see those multiple layers of questions to guide conversation and instruction that gradually becomes more focused. So we see where we have our design challenges, which has those that really gets at those dilemmas in history and civics content. Then we get into those content themes, driving questions, and sample guiding questions. So we gradually see a more focused questioning that happens. This roadmap is full of questions and inquiry, which is amazing, and really taking the time to kind of dive into a few of them. And that's what we'll do today. So first of all, just reminding us of those 5 design challenges. As we think about these 5 design challenges, they really encourage educators to lean into the tension that arises in history and civics instruction. We know lots of times those are the topics and those conversations that we sometimes shy away from in the classroom. And so today, as we're diving into design challenge number 2, some of you might be thinking, hey, we dove into that design challenge last time. Theme 3 is also connected to design challenge number 2. And with design challenge number 2, really thinking about how can we integrate the perspectives and of all Americans from all different backgrounds in narrating our history. And as we think about this, we're moving our thought and thinking and understanding with design challenge number 2, with theme number 3, moving away from the physical landscape, which we talked about in our previous session, thinking about maps, lands, and how those groups have created society, but actually shifting our conversation to think about the people as a political concept. Now, when we think about our 7 themes, we have those 7 themes and the 5 design challenges really help us rethink and reprioritize what goes into our curriculum, allowing us to develop an even more focused educational plan that holistically teaches the full complexity of American history and civics in a way that more deeply engages your local student population. Now, today, as I mentioned before, we are going to be diving into theme 3, We the People. Now, on the EAD website, Educating for American Democracy, on the EAD website, you'll be able to find a description of all of the themes. So if you're wondering, hey, what is theme 1, theme 2, feel free, go back to the website. and my colleagues will drop that link into the chat. Go back into the website and you'll be able to read a description and actually toggle between the different grade levels. So as we think about theme number 3 today, we the people. So as we think about we the people, really, as I said before, thinking about it as a political concept, not just a group of people who shared that physical space, okay, really leaning into that. And as we see these thematic questions, so each of our themes has thematic questions, both from a history perspective and a civics perspective. But as we see these thematic questions from a history perspective, we see who are we the people of the United States and how has the nation's population changed over time? Okay, what does our history reveal about the aspirations and tensions captured by the motto E pluribus unum? And then we have those civic thematic questions that really have us thinking about why does constitutional democracy depend on the idea of the people? What values, virtues, and principles can knit together we the people of the United States of America? So you can see as these thematic questions start to spark some thinking about how is our population connected? How has it changed over time? And this concept of the people, okay, and which we're going to dive into. Now, as we think about these concepts and these thematic questions, we also have key concepts from K5 and 612. So here you can see each of the 2 grade bands on both ends kind of grouped together. But as we look at these key concepts, we can see where concepts like examine definitions of citizenship can help lead into more complex discussions in 612, where you're analyzing the impact of enslavement, indigenous removal, immigration, and other hard histories on the definitions and pathways to citizenship. So as we see this relationship, we see where those key concepts in K5 really build into 612, and we see that combined. So we see that vertical alignment, which is one of the aspects as a former elementary teacher that I really love about the roadmap. So we can see another example there. And let's actually dive into the questions. So as I mentioned before, we have our questions that go across K-12. And one of the powerful things about the roadmap is you see concepts that are established in K2 build up into these more complicated concepts into the older grades across K-12. Now, one of the foundational pieces, so if we look at these questions here, what kinds of stories, including non-European perspectives, tell us who we are and where we are from? Okay, how do people become a community? Why do we have rules? So we see these concepts from the historical perspective and the civics perspectives, and we can see where they gradually become more complex. In 3.5, leading into how has the US population changed over time? How have push and pull factors challenged the US population over time and caused some challenges and some areas of success? But where we see that push and pull factor, and then starting to think about how are we getting into some of these hard histories that we see here, and starting these conversations in the lower grades so that our students have a foundation of understanding as they progress up until 6, 8, and 9, 12. Okay. And you can see those challenges, as I mentioned it in 3.5, we see it come to the surface in 6.8 in terms of that first history question. In what ways and to what extent have the diverse people of the US become one nation and face challenges in that? Okay. What is pluralism and how is that relevant to the American experience? So you see the complexity build up and spiral through the grade levels, which is one of the fabulous characteristics of the roadmap, because we're setting the foundation of knowledge in kindergarten and really building that up through the older grades. Now, one other piece that I'm adding in here today, as we think about this concept of both the aspirations and the tensions of we the people, one of the elements from the report, so the EAD report, as I mentioned in the beginning, has some amazing thought-provoking ideas throughout the report itself and in the appendix specifically. But one of the aspects that I really love for us to stop and think about is as we think about incorporating those multiple perspectives and multiple narratives into our history, both through the path, from the past through the present, and consistently doing that, thinking about How are we making sure that we're incorporating diversity and inclusion for civic purposes? Understanding that we want to move beyond the checklist and just make sure we've incorporated this perspective and this perspective, but actually thinking about how can incorporating the diversity and inclusion of those perspectives really deepen our civic understanding. So as we see here, I'll leave this up here just for a moment that you can, so that you can read it. Trying not to rush you today. But as we think about this, thinking about what are the skills necessary? So even just that first bullet, to develop skills to consider one's perspective, to understand how the world may look to our fellow citizens and civic participants with whom we must govern the country and our communities together. Okay, learning how to interpret others' expressions of ideas and values. Okay, we see all of these different concepts and skills and really taking the time to think about as we're incorporating these multiple perspectives into our conversation, how are we doing so to make sure that we're deepening our student learning rather than just doing a checklist and moving on? And so I know that was a lot in terms of your EAD overview, thinking a little bit about our theme and our design challenges today. But at this point, what I would love for you to do is actually stop for a minute and think about, okay, how can the EAD roadmap spark thinking about diversity and inclusion for civic purposes? So think about some of the questions that you saw in the beginning. Think about how can incorporating these different narratives and these different perspectives really deepen student learning? And you'll see on our Padlet for today. And those of you who are just joining us, lovely to see you all here today. On your landing site for today, if you scroll down, you can see that question right there. How can the EAD roadmap spark thinking about diversity and inclusion for civic purposes? In order to give you a moment to stop, think, actually pause, I'm going to go back to the slides and put that list back up because we know some of you are like, oh man, I wish Natasha had left that list there. Here it is again. Take a moment, go ahead and read through some of those examples and think about the roadmap. And we'll give us just another minute or so to stop, think, and process. This is the great part of these sessions. We actually stop and think. We know sometimes you're in these sessions and you're just keep getting more information rather than stopping, thinking, and having that time to understand. And I always find with our site, everyone's kind of taking their time, typing in, and then we suddenly start to see some ideas. So it allows me to learn alongside my students about the many perspectives that make up our nation's history. I think that's a fabulous point to make, that learning alongside your students, you do not have to be the expert. You can help facilitate that learning, okay? Facilitate that thinking and that conversation. Wonderful. And I'm sure we're going to have some other thoughts pop up here in just a moment. Take your time while you are pondering and thinking about that connection between diversity and inclusion and civic purpose. Taking that time as we dive into some of our further conversations, you're going to keep that thought kind of coming back. You know, how does this feel a little bit different than just our traditional way of continuing with the same narrative? Excellent. Thank you for those of you who are sharing your thoughts. Okay, students will be able to learn about history, past and present, okay, how it shaped our country and to what it is today. Concrete lessons. I love that. Concrete lessons in the key ideas, in the key questions and ideas. That's right. Sometimes this can be overwhelming. That's why we have a whole series of workshops. There is no way you can master this at once. So we definitely appreciate those of you who are coming back, continuing to engage in the conversation. So helping my students understanding of personal values, principles, and commitments despite diverse experiences. Okay, wonderful. Keep your ideas coming and sharing them here. I'm going to share one last aspect. We've touched upon the challenges, we've touched upon the themes and the driving questions, and the last piece that I do want to share is the 6 core pedagogical principles. And as we think about these 6 core pedagogical principles, thinking about how principles 1 through 3 really have us stop and think about the learning environment and the dispositions that are being established in order to get into some rigorous instruction. We all know that we want to jump into this rigorous content, but we want to make sure that we're establishing the environment in order to be able to do so. And with that, when you look at the EAD Pedagogic Companion, you'll see the what, the why, the how, really setting the rationale and the reasoning and the research behind these different principles. And then we have these teacher moves and these student moves. Now, these moves, which are something that I really love, these moves actually help us think about what are some ways that we can actually start doing this in the classroom. So if we look at an example of Principle 3, building an EAD ready classroom and school, where that's really diving into having the EAD teachers cultivate and sustain a learning environment, not just in their classroom, but think about what does it mean as a whole school building, okay? Part of this shift that we want to see is that understanding that teachers, you have a lot on your plate and you do so much at creating that environment. What does that begin to look like across a whole school community? And when we think about the teacher moves and the school and district leader moves, we also have student moves with these as well, thinking about how do we want to make sure that we're intentionally seeking to learn more about our students and families and building those relationships, both with those families and amongst the students, and thinking about how we're helping our students engage in these productive disagreements and solve conflict. And part of the reason that I really wanted to highlight this principle 3 today, building an EAD ready classroom and school, is as we think about these conversations, as we try to balance the aspirations and the tensions of history and getting these different perspectives, there's going to be times when there's going to be some tough conversations and hard histories that you have to engage in. And in order to do so, you want to make sure that you're establishing the learning environment in order to get there. And so that way your classroom environment is really a place where students can have those productive dialogues, have those productive conversations, and where you can then dive into some primary source documents and look at evidence and analyze. But in order to do so, got to set that foundation first. And on that note, I am so excited to welcome Rachel Davison Humphries to our conversation today. So excited that she's here. I'm going to slide over my screen. There we go. So Rachel is the Director of Outreach at the Bill of Rights Institute. She leads the team that helps lead outreach initiatives, develops new programs and products, and fosters close relationships with BRI's network of 50,000 teachers, and designs marketing campaigns. Now, prior to 2016, when she joined BRI, she worked for almost a decade as an educator, mentor, and trainer in middle school, high school, and university environments. So I'm so excited that she is here today. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. We know sometimes as presenters, it's so much easier to drive the slides ourselves. I'm going to welcome Rachel, and Rachel, take it away.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and the team at iCivics and the EAD Roadmap. I'm really excited to be here. BRI has been a driving partner in the EAD program for a long, long time. Our president, Dr. David Bobb, has been working with all of the leadership on the steering committee since its inception. So we're really excited to continue to grow the network around the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. And this conversation is really quite near and dear to our hearts. Again, my name is Rachel Davison Humphries. I was a classroom teacher for many years before joining BRI almost 6 years ago now, which is crazy to think about. But if you're not familiar with the Bill of Rights Institute, we are a national civics organization. Our mission is to engage, educate, and empower individuals with a passion for the freedom and opportunity that exists in a free society. We engage, educate, empower all with this idea that we should be free to enjoy the life, liberty, and pursue our own happiness. But really what BRI does is we teach civics. We provide compelling learning experiences, engaging original content, all that fosters the principles and virtues of American liberty and opportunity. We're mostly a teacher service organization. So our network of now close to 60,000 teachers, we have a community of them. We have tons of different opportunities, and all of our resources like iCivics are free at the point of use for educators because we're donor supported. So everything we do is available to you, all 4,000 different resources, and we design them with a number of different design inputs. We have our founding principles, we have our learning design, we have our scholars, and we have our teacher network, and everything we design integrates those design features. But the thing that makes BRI is that all of our resources are built on a foundation of the founding principles. So this is our design framework. And this is a brand new document. You can actually go to our website, and if you just type in founding principles, this will pop right up. You can download it. It's a great one for your students to have available to them. Actually, I'll put it in the chat in a little bit. But what this does, and again, this is our design framework, is it takes that foundation of natural rights and really clearly delineates how they build on one another with simple definitions. So again, Bill of Rights Institute, most of our resources are, Natasha mentioned she has the elementary school energy. I was a middle school teacher for most of my time in the classroom. And so I definitely have like the middle school energy. I miss them terribly. An 8th grade girl is the funniest person on the planet. And I miss them dearly. But so our resources are built really for 7th through 12th grade. We have a couple of resources that could be used in kind of 5th, 6th grade that are very narrative driven, but the vast majority of what we do is really designed for the early adolescent and the adolescent learner. So this founding principles document takes that natural rights foundation and builds on it. And you can search, actually, if you're looking to increase the robustness of your exploration of these principles, you can filter our resources on our website by each principle. And we take them very seriously because we use them to design our curriculum framework, or our design framework, which is our Educating for Self-Governance pedagogy, which takes the founding principles and maps them onto skills and literacies. And so I know iCivics has a lot of their own kind of design frameworks. This is the one BRI is working to finalize. It's very exciting, but you'll see that we think about all of these different dispositional literacies that map. One of the projects we're doing is we're mapping these onto the EAD framework to create a framework that's mirrored. So I want to just reiterate, Natasha did a fantastic job just as an overview, but one of the things that I love about the EAD framework, and so, I left the classroom before EAD existed, but if I had been in the classroom, one of the things that I really appreciated is that this isn't a curriculum, it's a roadmap, right? It gives you a check on your own curriculum design. It gives you guidance on how to make sure that your own knowledge is expanded to include all the different aspects. We all, as educators, we love our content areas often, or we love our students or our subjects or whatever it is, but we have limited time and resources. And so the EAD brought together, like you said, 300 different representatives to create this framework to really have you ask yourself, am I doing what I think I'm doing? It's really a check. It's not a prescription. It's a way to check on your own understanding as you do your kind of classroom design work. So this is the overarching thematic questions I find really, really compelling. We the People is where BRI kind of sits organizationally. Again, we are an American history focused organization. And so thinking about our unifying characteristics is something we do a lot, as with the founding principles and virtue work that we do. But this question of who are we the people of the United States? How has that nation's population changed over time? And what does our history reveal about the aspirations and tensions captured by the motto E Pluribus Unum? I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I've been working on a presentation to really think through kind of what is the unifying characteristic? What does it mean to be one as we are many? But then marrying the history and the civics. So this is something BRI does. We're history and civics organization. We're US history and civics. We focus on both government and US history. But why does the constitutional democracy depend on the idea of we the people? I'll touch on that later. And what values, virtues, and principles can knit together we the people of the United States of America? As I mentioned, we have our own principles document that we think are unifying and universal. And that's a good starting place and a good conversation to have with your students. are they universal? Are those ideas universal? And then, as Natasha mentioned, this kind of spiraled key concepts that really build on one another. The 6 to 12 one actually is the same. It doesn't change. The key concepts and questions are the same for 6 to 9 and 9 to 12 because there's such a continuum there with the knowledge and understanding. And so those are great, again, starting place, just asking those questions or making sure that whatever you're teaching in your history and civics content reflects these kinds of questions. And then the driving questions that really push the ideas into your resources. Questions about pluralism and the distinctive challenges accompanied with race that Natasha touched on when it comes to equity, inclusion, and diversity. And then the questions about how am I reflected in these? What is my story? How does it intersect? Is an essentially American question, as I'll touch on in a moment. Okay, so I wanted to just bring those ideas back up to have them in the top of your mind as we're going through this presentation. How many of you, just like a thumbs up, have heard of this idea of a threshold concept? Have you guys ever heard of this? Thumbs up, anyone? Oh, that's so exciting. So I love it when that happens. I did my master's work at Georgetown in learning design and technology. And this, okay, so Tammy's heard of it before. And I see a few of my friends in the chat, so it's nice to see everybody. I love our little civic friendships, our civic community that comes together at these webinars. So a threshold concept is a concept within a field. So you're talking about a field of knowledge, a knowledge domain that represents a transformed way of understanding or interpreting or viewing something without which the learner cannot progress. So I want you to think about, when you were first studying physics and you learned about entropy, or when you were first studying justice and you learned about privilege. And you can't unsee the world that way now, right? It transformed your view or landscape in a particular discipline, how you perceive, apprehend, or experience particular phenomena within that discipline. What I loved about, so this got very jargony very quickly, right? We got into academic theory very quickly, but the practical application of this was, what are the concepts within history and civics that transform a student's understanding of their community? What are they? And how do you bring those into your classroom? And that's an organizing principle that you can use. I've done it with some curriculum design I've done. And it really, if you think about if my end goal is that transformative understanding, how do I backwards design my resources to do that? And that's a way, there are a lot of ways to design your curriculum, but this idea of a threshold concept, this thing that once you see it, you can't unsee it, is a really nice way to kind of create a thread of understanding for your students. So I wanted to introduce that idea. So again, a threshold concept has a couple of, key characteristics. It's transformative, it's irreversible. Once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? In economics, the idea of opportunity cost, right? You can't unsee it once you know it. It's irreversible. It integrates other understandings. And the last thing is that it's possibly troublesome. And this idea of troublesome meaning, it might change things in an uncomfortable way for you. Or it might integrate things that you weren't expecting. And so there's a bit of a troublesomeness to it, right? I'm sure you've all had experiences where you understood something, you're like, oh no, right? Or you've understood something, you're like, oh yes, right? Like, so that's the idea of this threshold concept. So here's my thought. When tasked with the question of what unifies us, what makes us we the people, I have a suggestion. And this suggestion is the thing that unifies us as we the people is that America is a propositional nation. What does that mean? Okay, so we're going to take about 10 minutes. We're going to do a close read. You guys ready? Okay, so this idea of the propositional nation actually comes from the Gettysburg Address. And there's a bit of literature out on this. I can send some links. I can put them in the Padlet so you can refer to them. I didn't send them to Natasha in advance. I could have, but I forgot. I jumped from another webinar right to this one. Today was, and I just got back from vacation on Sunday. It's been a very busy week, but I will get them to her. So this idea of the propositional nation comes from the first sentence of the Gettysburg Address, where he says, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So let's do a little bit of a close read. What is a nation? For most of human history, a nation is a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language, inhabiting a particular country or territory. Pretty standard definition of a nation. The problem is, the United States doesn't really fall under that definition. You can make the argument maybe that it's a particular country or territory, but our states are very distinct. Living in California is a very different thing than living in Nebraska, which is a very different thing than living in Maine, which is a very different thing than living in South Carolina. So I wonder, if we think of ourselves as a nation, how does that idea of a nation fit? So for Lincoln, he's making a claim here, and he's making the claim that this nation is unified because it is dedicated to a proposition. And that's what makes it a nation. What does he mean by dedicated? Devoted to a cause, ideal, or purpose. And a proposition is a statement or assertion that expresses a judgment or opinion. So what is the thing that unites us? That we are a nation, we are a group of humans. And the thing that unifies us is our dedication to this proposition. So there are some other clauses in here that are a conversation for a different time. The whole thing about fathers bringing forth in conception, there's a conversation there that I'm sure we could have. That could be really fun, but that's not the conversation for this time. But the idea is that there has been one time in human history or the first time in human history where a group of people came together to create a nation based not on common descent or history or culture or language, but on this idea that all men are created equal, on this proposition. And you can talk about whether or not that was intentional or accidental in the Declaration. You can ask a lot of questions about what all men meant and whether that was unifying at the time or whether it was a useful tool to unify later. But the kind of conceptual understanding that the thing that unites us is that we are a propositional nation, unlike other nations in that way, is my kind of challenge and thought and idea to you. So I'd like you to go in on the Padlet and kind of digest that for a moment. Is America a propositional nation? Is that what unifies us? And what's troublesome about this idea for you? So I'm going to give you a moment to go into the Padlet that Natasha so kindly created for us. Such a useful pedagogical tool. Thank you for modeling the pedagogy, Natasha.
My pleasure. And you can see there's a Padlet right there that just has you thinking, giving you a space to think about the conversation with Rachel.
Is America a propositional nation? And what is challenging about that idea? I'll pause for a second. And Natasha, what's my time check?
You are still doing amazing.
Okay. So as you're thinking about that, I'll put our founding principles back up. Because again, for the Bill of Rights Institute, we take this idea that we're a propositional nation dedicated to that we're a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And it's not accidental that it has to be dedicated, right? That word isn't accidental. It has to be a commitment to that idea, not just not just not just a statement that sits there, but it has to be that active commitment. So again, the Bill of Rights Institute, we use that proposition that all men are created equal as the foundation of all other rights in the United States that we have and we explore. So we have these natural and inalienable rights to life, liberty, liberty, equality, and justice. They are the root of what we do. And then you build on that with consent and limited government and the auxiliary precautions, and then finally the Bill of Rights. But all that only exists if we have this common idea of the natural, inalienable, dedicated to the proposition. So how do we do that as teachers? How do we help our students explore this? And I'm going to let you sit with that. That idea that America is a propositional nation might be a bit troublesome. I know that. How do we do that? How do we put that into action? Well, the EAD drew on what were called the 6 proven practices, the model for high quality civic education. If you're not familiar with these terms, of civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic dispositions, Natasha mentioned them Natasha mentioned dispositions in her description of the EAD. That's the attitudes important in a democracy. So, or civic dispositions towards democracy are the attitudes important in a democracy, such as a sense of civic duty and concern for the welfare of others. But then you have the skills and knowledge. And what the EAD really does well is integrates civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic dispositions, and uses what were the 6 proven practices. So this was a document that was put out in the 90s that really took a look at all the literature about civic education and identified 6 practices, like curricular practices, pedagogical practices, and then EAD built on these practices. If you're not familiar with them, they are classroom instruction, discussion of current events, service learning, extracurricular activities, student participation in school governance, and simulations of democratic processes and procedures. So then, touching on, again, what Natasha mentioned, even if we are all dedicated to this proposition, we're still a very diverse society, right? We are a pluralist society beyond, like, the differences seemingly outnumber the commonalities. So the question is, how do we honor those differences and cultivate shared values in our classrooms? How do we create the we the people idea? How is that our duty as democratic educators? BRI thinks a lot about viewpoint diversity in the classroom. And I want to share this particular quote because anytime that I'm really frustrated, I take this quote and I sit with it for a little bit. This is John Stuart Mill's on the liberty of thought and discussion. He's talking about the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion. Because the idea would be that you would silence wrong opinion. It's not the right thing. We shouldn't be teaching it to our children, right? There's a large conversation happening in the United States right now about who decides what children learn. It's not a unique conversation to our time. It's a conversation that's been going on for as long as there has been so as long as there's been education. There was this guy who was once poisoned for teaching children, or he drank the poison for teaching children. So this conversation has been going on a while. It is not unique, but it is new in our time. And so John Stuart Mill said that the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race. So regardless of the opinion, it's robbing the human race. Posterity, as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion, still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth by its collision with error. I think that one of the things as we think about, managing multiple viewpoints in our classroom, but also presenting multiple viewpoints in our community in order to better explore what unites us. We think about student agency. Offering multiple perspectives gives students the opportunity for agency in the conversation. You as the educator, the students come into your classroom with a lot of ideas. And as we have the opportunity to give the students the opportunity to practice their democratic virtues by giving them the opportunity to explore those multiple viewpoints to practice that. Because we all know they're not getting a lot of practice in how to explore multiple viewpoints outside of classrooms in many communities. So there's always a fundamental tension with that. As educators, we feel kind of bound by two different duties, and the duty to hold space for student voice and agency and opinion. And that means not giving our own, but hold that space for them. So they're influenced by the ideas, but not necessarily by our personality, is one tension. And on the other side is we have a duty to be models of conviction. We are a model adult in their environment. So how do we hold those two ideas in tension with one another as we explore multiple viewpoints? I think just it needs to be intentional. And it's something, again, EAD explores in the pedagogical practices section. BRI uses a lot of different strategies in order to encourage multiple viewpoints and explore what unites us. Socratic discussion, document-based question activities, point-counterpoint essays, turning point simulations and discussions. We focus a lot on Socratic learning. That's my background. I was a Socratic educator and Socratic trainer for a lot of my teaching career. And I think about the independence and the ability to make sense of information, the reasoning, the abstraction, the self-awareness, that the classroom becomes a micro society. And students have to work out and practice the democratic virtues. Where else do they get the chance? In a controlled environment where they can put on different ideas and practice those virtues of civil discourse and respect. And it lets students explore their own interests and personal connection in ways that we can't predict, because we don't know exactly what their needs are. When you have 120 kids a semester, 150 kids as the case may be, a lot of that exploration is new to you too, because you just didn't know where they were coming from. But it also, again, creates that community culture that supports democratic society. A lot of our resources, if you're not familiar, the Bill of Rights Institute last year published Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. In this, we have a lot of these pedagogical practices. It's a full curricular resource that included 96 scholars and over 400 different components. But there we have a bunch of new document-based questions. But if you're not familiar, document-based questions take very short pieces of documents and put them in conversation with one another through graphic organizers or a series of questions. And BRI has over 50 free DBQs on our website. We have them Supreme Court ones, but also 20th century, essential understandings. We also created 35 point-counterpoint essays. So if you remember in the 90s, there were these little volumes that somehow disappeared. I loved them, but we recreated something similar. We have 35 different essays with 2 scholars, each writing one perspective on an issue. So things like, is the Constitution a pro-slavery document? To what extent were manifest destiny and westward expansion justified? We have 35 of these different essays. And so we have a ton of different resources for you. We are here for you. I'm going to stop my screen share and see if anything came up in our conversations. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to present. Like I said, we're here for you. We are a support to the Educating for American Democracy framework and the roadmap. And I'm going to take a quick look to see if there's anything that I want to touch base on in the chat. But Natasha, is there anything that I missed or you want me to follow up on? I know I still may have a few minutes.
No, I think, Rachel, I think you've given us so much to chew on. I know I'm sitting here like, thinking and analyzing. So I think that's exactly what we want these sessions to do. So just a huge thank you to you, Rachel, for taking the time, kind of giving us some of these tough concepts to really kind of grapple with and to think about. So thank you so much, Rachel. And Rachel is here. She's not going anywhere. She might try to turn off her camera, but that's
I will
okay.
turn off my camera. I have a small person who I may have to go grab.
Small people are perfectly acceptable. So on that note, just a huge thank you, Rachel, for giving us some of that thought-provoking ideas. And what I would love for us to continue the conversation now is I'm going to now introduce, which I'm very excited. I'm going to shuffle around my screens a little bit here. So before I show my screen, I am going to introduce Jen Rydell. So excited to have her here today. She is going to be amazing, and I'll give you her official bio. I always love reading everyone's official bios because sometimes it's like, wow, to hear it out loud. So Jen Rydell is a committed civics educator and has taught social studies for 25 years. Currently, she teaches civics, law and society, and U.S. history at Options High School, a public alternative high school in Bellingham School District in Washington State, which serves marginalized students needing a non-traditional pathway in their education. Jen is a James Madison Fellow, an American Civic Education Teacher Award recipient, former civics teacher in residence at the Library of Congress, Golden Apple awardee, and recent recipient of the Street Law Classroom Champion Award. So we are so glad and so excited to have her with us today. And I'm going to share my screen and drive the slides for Jen. And I can't wait.
Well, thank you all for being here. I know you're in a variety of time zones, and that also means a lot of you have put in a really long day. And the fact that you're here in whatever shape or capacity, whether you're in your sweats or still in your classroom, props to all of you. As Natasha said, my passion for the vast majority of my career has been civics and law-related education. And I am literally thrilled about the EAD, and they're not paying me to say this. In fact, there's been no transaction of money ever. When I heard and saw the EAD and what it was, I was like, finally, we're having a national coordinated conversation, and one that acknowledges hard questions and ones that are essential. So I'm really excited to be here. I do not have the corner on the market of ideas or strategies. I am just one person that sits in a classroom and keeps throwing spaghetti noodles of learning opportunities against the wall to kids. And the ones that I'd like to highlight today are some that I think are working. I'm still developing them. So you'll see at the end of my slides, and also from Natasha, there's contact information. I am more than happy for you to follow up if I said something that made you go, huh, how do you do that? Or why do you do that? More than happy for you to even drop those things in the chat. So I do want to say that in addition to my current role of working at a alternative school, which I know you say alternative school means a whole lot of things to people. Most of the kids walking through our doors, school's not gone too well. In fact, I can't really think of any student where school's doing awesome. And so they're coming to us because they need something different than whatever the comprehensive school experience has been for them. So I say that because if you're sitting in this audience and you're like, rah, EAD, but how do you do this with struggling learners? And what do you do when you have kids with massive deficits of background knowledge and skill gaps? Okay, well, write a book for me and I'll buy it, number one. But number two, I don't have concrete answers entirely to that, but I'm trying to live it out. So what I'm going to share with you today are things that I have learned in my current placement. And prior to this, I worked almost 20 years in a comprehensive high school, teaching at grade level, US history, law, AP government, politics. So like I've kind of run the gamut. So I'm hoping something that I throw out to you today will be helpful to you. So we're going to give you a little activity to do right now because it's midway through a webinar and you got to do something, although you've already done your Padletting, that's a verb. So for me, when I'm translating a very, I think, in-depth topic for students of, let's talk about who the we the people is and who are we as a nation. When we look in the mirror, what do we think about ourselves? Well, if you're asking kids that question right now in this very complex historical moment, I don't know what all your experience is, but mine is, it's been a little rough hearing what they have to say and what they've watched the adults in the room. and the things that have caught their attention. So I'm also finding students don't necessarily come to me with having had those maybe family-based conversations of what do we believe as Americans, or what are collective ideals that bind us as the national glue, if they exist. So when I do this activity with students that we're going to do right now with you, I just am asking you a question. And the root of it is, what is an American? And I always have sentence, many of you do this, I know, sentence stems or sentence starters for people, because sometimes we just need a little nudge of getting our thinking going. So in the chat, I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to be honest, and I have my timer. I'm going to mute myself once I give the instructions, and you're going to have 2 minutes. And I'd like you to think about, and I know that's not enough to decide what our collective identity is, or one identity that it is. But if you could pick one of the, or go rogue, do your own. If you would respond to this idea, what is an American? And I gave you some sentence times to do. I'd love you just to put, if you feel comfortable, if you don't, and you just want to ruminate at home and write it down somewhere, that's fine too. If you want to tweet about it, do that. Just do right by us. So I'm going to start the timer, and you're going to have 2 minutes, and I'd love to see what comes up in the chat of people's thinking. And there is, okay, for those of you that love right answers, there is not a right answer, okay? So everything is okay. So we're going to start the time. You've got 2 minutes to ponder and drop your brilliance in the chat. We have about 15 seconds on our time. I'd encourage you, if you're still formulating some thinking, to do so. I'm going to do what I have found to be a really good practice with students and anyone. I would like to read some of these out loud because I want to validate that you took the time and energy to write this. Stephanie had written, "We the people" means that all people who live in this country should have the same say in how the country is run and the opportunities to succeed. Maria added, "An American is someone who believes in the rule of law and respect of institutions." Maddie chimed in, "An American is someone who believes our whole is greater than the sum of our parts, that synergies beget innovation, and that every voice counts in this messy process." A hearty amen to that. Karen had put in that "we the people" does not mean old white cisgendered men. Okay, oh, this is already getting my juices flowing of what we can talk about. Rebecca had said "an American is someone who respects our Constitution." Kelly put in "we the people" represents the white race. Darlene had added "an American is someone who can start from the wrong side of the track and end up as leader of the free world." Interesting things to chew on. And then Carl had written, "An American is anyone who identifies themselves as thus and behaves in a manner that promotes our society and our core beliefs." Okay, we have just scratched the top of this, or touched, or whatever metaphor we're using, this iceberg, this idea of, I mean, who or what is an American, and how do how do we move forward as a nation with that identity? It's so rich and so deep of where we can go with this. And for students start to see that as well. And I know that sometimes I think this is, I kind of chide myself because I do this in the beginning. For me, I teach, some of you are chronological in your US history approach, some of you are thematic, some of you are a blend of that. Some of you have very tight pacing guides. Some of you might be like me where they say, teach US history. And you say, what would you like me to teach? And they say, you're the expert, which is code for we haven't invested in social studies since No Child Left Behind. So wherever you fall on this, recognize, and you know your student, or you'll need to do an assessment of your students. Do they have a good idea of, because they don't have a good idea of American history, it's very hard to say who are we as a people, because who we are as a people is the sum total of our variety of experiences. And so you might have to come at this at a different angle. But the way I see it from what I saw in the chat, and I see we've had a few more additions, is that there's different ways of lenses you can approach this with students. So the first one that we're going to approach has more of, as you can see there, we the people through the lens of an American creed. And I use that because I'm going to point to a resource later on that uses the phrase American creed. Who are we as people? What are those fundamental ideas that bind and guide us as people? And I'm not saying this as a means to whitewash differing views of those ideals, or when those ideals we have mightily fallen short and when we might have achieved them or close to that. I'm just wanting us to think, what are the things, even if we talk about equality, we can have varying definitions of that. But is that something that our students can identify is part of who we are as a people, seeking to be equal justice under law, seeking to have equality of opportunity for all? And so I approach it with students that we look at, when has there been unity, when has there been division, and how we achieve these aspirational goals. So I kind of have like a twin effort here. One is a philosophical lens I use with kids. And then the second one, which you'll see just now, is we focus on this idea of citizenship. And I traditionally hit who are we, what are we as Americans? And then we go into immigration history. And within immigration history as a theme, I look at case studies of different groups and their experiences and the receptiveness or lack thereof of their presence in the country. And then followed up by that, going back to this, who are we as a people according to the law, and according to how the rule of law has included this, is citizenship. So who gets the rights and privileges and benefits that correspond to being an American? And how has that definition of granting citizenship, how has that been challenged and eventually expanded? And to achieve all this, I use several methodologies, of which Rachel already laid down a whole bunch that I use, which I love. Rachel and I really haven't met each other digitally until today, so this was great. But I am as some of you heard, I worked at the Library of Congress, so I was already a fan of primary sources. I am even more a fan of primary sources. And so I use them in a variety of ways, whether or not kids have ever looked at the primary source I give them visuals, I give them everything you can. We look at background readings and case studies to achieve our idea of what is an American philosophically and what is an American when it comes to citizenship. And then I'll identify for you today some things that I've had students do, specifically creating a found poem using primary source documents that answer that question of who is an American and what do they believe, okay? So we'll move forward. And one of the things I've done that has worked really well, it worked well with masks on kids where it's harder to hear each other. And it worked well when we were talking about earlier that one of the goals within us having a deliberate civic focus in our schools, whether that be in a history class, a dedicated US government or civics or whatever it is in between, is that we have inclusive practices. And what I love about the title of this is taken from Facing History in Ourselves, which I think we have some links that can drop in the chat. And I have a Google Doc we could give you too with all of these links. But Facing History in Ourselves does a nice job of explaining what big paper building a silent conversation is. And some of you have already done this, or you do it, or you did, you forgot about it. But ultimately what I liked about this is I took that strategy and because I don't know about you, but I tend to have the same frequent flyers that do all the talking in my class, or they can if I'm not deliberate on trying to share the love. So how do you do this for kids that don't see themselves as worthy of sharing their information? Well, so you have a silent conversation, and I used, so for that resource, you can check out Facing History and Ourselves. And then I took primary sources that addressed in some shape or form what is an American. So you can see some images there. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that I had kids analyzing on large pieces of paper, and they were initially put in one group. And in that group, then they each had a different color pen, and they were prompted, and I gave them sentence stems if they needed it. And they were to ask questions or make observations about their image or their excerpt that they had in front of them. In the upper left is an excerpt from a letter of the Grand Council Fire of American Indians. It was a letter written in, I believe it's December of 1927 to the mayor of Chicago, challenging how history is being told in the Chicago schools, and is challenging how a Native American perspective has been left out and needs to be included. So kids read that, and then they write their comments in their initial group. You can see there on the far right, there's an image there. This was a poster that was produced during World War II, and it was promoting this idea that there is no discrimination within the workforce. We need unity during the war efforts. And so kids looked at, well, what does this image suggest people at some moment in time and in history thought about who or what is an American? And so it's an interesting conversation for kids to both look at the imagery on this poster as well as the last names used and the FDR quote. The lower left-hand corner, this is actually you can say it's the WAMBA, the insurance agency, and it's an ad taken out in a newspaper. Or some of you might know this. There was actually an I Am an American Day holiday. And it was a day that was recognized people who had gone through the naturalization process to become US citizens. And ceremonies were held across the country. And so for a period of time, you can see in local newspapers, if you pull up this, and this happens to be from the Library of Congress, you can find all these ads of companies that want to promote themselves as being patriotic, and they're reminding people about this holiday. And so the kids looked at that. And then the far right one is actually an excerpt from a speech given by a professor, Peter Ferrara, on 9/11. And his speech is all about what is an American, and that's in contrast to the terrorists that had attacked us. So he gave this speech about 3 weeks after that. So you can see the kids are writing on the poster. You can also see there's Post-it notes. So what I did is the kids were in their initial groups, and like a gallery walk, once I got a sense they had exhausted both making their own comments, writing to each other on their respective papers, I then had them rotate, and then they would I gave everybody 2 Post-it notes for each of the posters and asked them to make their own comments there, okay? If you're wondering, well, where could do I just have to go actually Google where to find all these images or these things? If you, we have a resource that's called Primary Source Nexus, and it's called Citizen University Primary Source Nexus. They're a phenomenal organization. They work with the Library of Congress, but they do a lot of the curating of things and package it so you as a teacher can grab it. If you've spent any time on the Library of Congress website, it's phenomenal, but it takes some doing to maybe get what you really want. And so Citizen University and Primary Source Nexus, they get grants from the library, and they are constantly putting together things. And I actually reached out to their director and said, hey, I'm trying to do what is an American unit? Can you help me out? And she put this all together for me. So she found the poster on the upper right, she found the insurance thing, and there's a whole list of things you can have fun with. So I really like this activity because it's an introductory activity for kids. They start to see each other's writing. And then when you're debriefing this, you can actually talk to them and say, okay, now that you've looked at all these respective images or read these excerpts, what ideas emerge for you? What themes come forward about when we answer this question, at least with these resources, of who or what is an American? What do they stand for? What do they believe? What don't they stand for? And what's interesting is that you can start to see, if you're deliberate in your selection of these sources, kids can start to see that the answer to that question often is influenced by the historical moment, particularly when it's wartime. We can look at the strong, certain version of patriotism that often influences a lot of these primary sources. Okay, so moving forward, so that's one, I love that. And then some of you, I don't know if anyone wants to give me a thumbs up in audience land, if anyone's seen American Creed. It's a PBS production from 2018. They have also collaborated with the National Writing Project. There's specific prompts that you can go and use, but they do a really nice job. It's about over, I think it might be 70 minutes. So you can use portions of it. They've packaged it into just sections. And what it's good at doing is it's a current day addressing of what does it mean to be American? How do we do hard histories? How do we address this? How do we reconcile that? How do people work together with different views? There's an excellent segment, particularly those of you that teach AP government politics, political identities. There's a really great segment in it where the founder of Move On, let's see, the Tea Party president, if you all remember the Tea Party as a political party that was pretty intense for a moment of time, Tea Party president and then MoveOn.org founder, they come together. And there's a whole segment of how they collaborate and what they talk about. And they start talking about, we have more shared things that we found in common than make us different. And so these segments, whether you choose to use the whole movie or portions of it, could act as a really good discussion point for kids, particularly for kids that probably aren't hanging out with each other saying, hey man, what do you think being American is? It's probably not a conversation kids are having. They're definitely hearing what people are saying, but they don't think American history is what Americans aren't. But what are we? And so I wonder if you can use this, if this works for you. Definitely, I didn't find anything offensive in it, but there isn't any, but definitely make sure you previewed it ahead of time. Look at the resources both PBS provides and the National Writing Project provides, and that might help you. Okay, so I do all this like prep work. We go into the next slide is going to talk about these found poems. And some of you have done found poems in different shapes or forms. Some of you might call it blackout poetry. So here's my version. Well, it's just my version after ripping off everybody else's versions. We worked as a class. Once I did these introductory activities of really thinking about what is an American, we did class, just like Rachel had talked about, like a deep dive into a document. And we would look like, our first one we look at as a class collectively is the Declaration of Independence. We do the close reading. We look at the context of it. We look at what is said. We look at what is not said until we're flexing their analysis skills of a primary source. And we're thinking about who's the author of it. And we look at how does this source answer the question, what is an American? Now, for some of your kids that some of the documents I chose were really obvious in how they answered those questions. And some of them were more nuanced. So depending on your student population, you're going to have to be savvy on giving some scaffolding and some supports. And maybe you're chunking things out. Maybe you're helping with, you have annotated definitions you're providing them, just like Rachel did at the beginning of her portion. So in class, we looked at, as you can see there, the Declaration of Independence, preamble. We looked at excerpts from the Dred Scott ruling, because that in itself, I also know it sets up my citizenship unit I'm going to do. And the excerpts of it start to define at that moment in time who is considered an American and the privileges and the rights that brings with it. We looked at the Gettysburg Address, Langston, Hughes. That was probably the resource, along with The Hill We Climb from Amanda Gorman, that resonated immensely with students. Many kids, if you left off, it was a 1936 document, they were like, wow, he is preaching. This is now. I really was trying to find a variety of sources, different time periods. This is just a smattering of what I worked with in the class. So these kids had practice in the classroom. We looked at, I have a dream speech, all 5 pages of it when I put it in a Word document, not just the one that makes it really nice meme or a phrase, which is important, but we went far beyond that. And even the kids, so I was having kids look at this in fall of 2020. So when they were reading portions, I have a dream speech, and they're looking at MLK saying that that African Americans still have a promissory note delivered to them, and they have not given the promises of equality. I mean, kids were like, wow, he was saying this in 1963. So we did all of this, and then what the kids had to do is I gave them some requirements of length of their poems, and what I asked them to do is answer the question themselves. What is an American? Do you think an American is dedicated to freedom, to equality, to justice? And some kids decided to focus their whole poem on that and then pull phrases and ideas out of their respective documents. So if we move forward, I have a student sample, and I'm going to read it to you because I don't know what your screens look like. I did the colors. If that annoys you, I'm sorry, that wasn't the intention. The colors are to let you know my students turned in their documents with footnotes because I required that they use X amount of excerpts, certain amount of phrases from different documents because I wanted them to show that they followed their theme all the way through their found poem. So this student focused on equality. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That's from the Declaration of Independence. Americans welcome people from all lands, all cultures, all religions. They are the embodiment of the human spirit of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's from Peter Ferrara's speech on what is an American after 9/11. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. That's from MLK, I Have a Dream. Next, and who are you that draws your veil across the stars? A bird stalks down his narrow cage. His wings are clipped, his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. That's Maya Angelou, Cage Bird. I am the man who never got ahead. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. That's Langston Hughes, Let America be America again. The free bird thinks another breeze and names the sky his own. But the whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the free bird and sky. We, the people, refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation. Revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice and true freedom emerges. But we cannot walk alone. Again, back to MLK. So this student was the first year I did this. This was all remote, I was like, what in the world am I doing? How are kids learning? How are they going to show learning? And so this ended up being a really good thing for kids to do online. And yet they're thinking and showing it to me. I've since evolved it. They have to do self-reflections and say, what message were you trying to send and answer the question, what is an American? Why did you use the phrases you did? I also learned, unless you tell kids, hey, you can't use like a massive paragraph from a document. You have to, the more sophisticated students, the ones that got the hang of this, they would use only like 3 or 5 words. But you're going to have everything across the board. For some kids are like, wait a minute, to plagiarize, that doesn't work. I'm confused. But once they got the hang of, you're answering the question, what is an American? And then you're picking phrases that resonate with you. I have another example of a student who is one of my, let's see, kind of merge slides here. I have the other sample, excellent. This other slide is a student who actually does have an individual education plan. They have some learning disabilities. They literally blew my socks off. They had 22 different footnotes in what they did. And they started off with, that's Amanda Gorman, The Hill We Climb. Kids really loved how she addressed history. And this student, you can see that even in the excerpt I gave you, there was so much more that they created. They used a lot of different sources. They really did like Amanda Gorman's. They loved Langston Hughes. And what I loved is that this student, the other student, focused on equality as an American value that we're working for or aspiring to, and we've not met. This student really focused on this idea that what are we about? And it's that sense of evolution as a nation and the moving forward and the ability to still move forward. And even when we fall short and we mightily fall short in equality and justice for all of our people. So we did those. And then, that was kind of like a big assessment for kids. And then after I taught them the immigration unit, which also hits us, who are we as Americans? We're a nation of immigrants. Are we? How do we treat immigrants? We go through all that. Then we return to this idea of the people that want to become citizens. What is the history of that in our nation? And so I've chosen to take back that who is we the people? How have we defined that? What does it mean to be an American? Why have certain groups been excluded in American citizenship? And that's back to that hard histories and having those conversations with students. And then how has the definition of citizenship been related to American historical events? Because we see those are closely intertwined. What is going on inside our country and outside of our country directly impacts whether we fling open our doors or close them or somewhere in between for our immigration. I didn't realize till now how dark this is. I apologize. those of you in audience land. So you can see here, I do case studies because I love court cases. Court cases to me are the nectar of social studies life because they're stories. At the core of them, they're narratives. And students always remember stories. They might not remember unrelated facts, but they remember stories. So we tell this story of Dred Scott and Dred Scott's journey to become an American citizen and what the Supreme Court said and how that court ruling situated in the context of the time period also reveals information of what was going down and would go down and occur with the Civil War. And then another case study we look at is Wong Kim Ark versus the United States. And if you haven't had a chance to learn about Wong Kim Ark and his history, we really owe a debt of gratitude to him because of his case, we have birthright citizenship in our nation. Whoever is born on US soil gets American citizenship. And it is because that is defined in his case. Both of those first two cases I mentioned that kids look at, those readings, they come from street law. If you're not acquainted with that organization, just like Bill of Rights Institute and iCivic, you need to buddy up with them. They put out some great resources that you can get a PDF and Word. For me, with students with different reading abilities, I love that I can modify the readings, insert text boxes, definitions. And so we use their pre-made case summaries to study how is citizenship defined and challenged. There's also been two other cases that help the kids see patterns or anomalies to those patterns. And one of them is the story of Bhagat Singh Thind. And he is an East Indian man who actually fights for the United States in World War I. He's honorably discharged. He gets citizenship, then he gets it taken away, and then he tries to get it again. And they say, no, you're not one of us. And his story is one that kind of unpacks how citizenship and the construction of race are closely intertwined in America. And then the last case that we look at is Azawa versus the United States, and that's a Japanese man who in the same time period as Bhagat Singh, he also has citizenship that is he's on the cusp of, and then he loses it, and he challenges it. And both of these cases, while not easy to teach because there's not a nice ending, there's not a happy ending of citizenship extended to all, it does help outline our varied story and history of how when people seek to become Americans, how has that been defined? So for me, you had Rachel give you all of these great ideas and kind of like this philosophy and pedagogy. And I'm telling you, I'm in the trenches like a lot of you, and this is how I've answered the questions of how to get kids thinking about who are we as Americans, both philosophically and as according to the law. So the final thing I would just point out to you is if you haven't already seen it, many of you might have, if you have access to Netflix, you're able to stream it at school. Netflix has a great documentary, Amend the Fight for America. Some of you might have seen it. Will Smith is a producer of it. And the first episode is phenomenal on citizenship and the 14th Amendment, which is a part of this conversation. And it really addresses how African Americans fought to get citizenship and that history of that. And it echoes a lot of what my citizenship unit addresses. So that was really, it resonated with kids. A caveat, please watch it first. They use historical language, particularly language that is racial and language that is derogatory. They give the power in the historical moment to the actors that are representing it. And you need to think about how you want to address that, if at all, with students, and if that's even appropriate in your respective classrooms. So I hope I've given you something like a professional spaghetti noodle that's stuck against the wall that you can use. If you have, by the way, I'm proud of my EAD wall. I took all the EAD questions and I typed them up, and then I found primary sources that were free, and I laminated. Don't talk about the environment. I laminated the crap out of all those, and that's on my wall. So if kids aren't listening to me, at least they're looking at the wall and they're absorbing our questions as civics educators. So if you have anything I can help you with, don't hesitate. Thank you for, hopefully you're all still here. Take care and carry on the fight.
Thank you so much, Jen. I think this is exactly why we bring educator voice to the conversation as well. Just the practicality. I love the spaghetti noodles. We're just throwing out all of these different ideas, and really that's where we have the opportunity to think about oh, this could work in my classroom. So right now, as we close out today, I'd first like you to just take a moment and thinking about your conversation with Jen, what concepts or ideas resonated with you? I know we're down to the last 4 minutes of our conversation today, but just taking a moment to stop and think about what can I bring back to my classroom? What do I want to try? What do I want to explore further? And taking a moment just to jot down some of those ideas. And you'll see, I'll show you just that Padlet there so that you can see it. Scroll down, there you go. So right there, you'll see just her, the other just quick note is that link, those recommended resources, that link is on here and has all of the running resources that Jen mentioned in her conversation. So you have access to that as well. So take a moment, stop, do a little processing, and I'm going to close out the session while you can listen with one ear while I do that. So on the EAD website, so Jen mentioned just a robust collection of resources. There's even more resources, educator resources on the EAD website. So if you have not gone to explore, please check out the website. Here you're going to have lots of lessons and units and resources directly aligned to the roadmap, the design challenges, the theme. So here's an example from Bill of Rights Institute. And the other piece is that they're actually by grade level too. So you'll see, obviously, we're going to share some iCivics resources too, but there's some interactive games. We have our DB quests and just a variety of resources. So be sure to go and explore those, looking at some new perspectives to bring into your classroom as you try to grapple with these tough concepts and hard histories. And as we wrap up for today, so you're taking a moment, you're thinking about what you want to bring back from Jen's session. And in our last 2 minutes, taking a moment now and actually doing your exit tickets, taking that time to stop, think about what you've learned between both Rachel's conversation, Jen's conversation, what you want to bring back to the classroom, and what you're still wondering. Take the moment and share that back to us. Whether you're looking to receive just a note saying that you've participated in the session or not, those kind of commentary really helps us continue to strengthen these sessions. So share your thoughts and ideas. We really welcome them. And finally, we always like to close our sessions with reiterating our ambitious goals. We know as we think about this work with EAD, why it is so important to have all of you in the conversation. We're talking about everyone, 60 million students, 100,000 schools, and 1 million teachers. Thinking about how are we providing all of our classrooms the opportunity to have this rich and rigorous history and civic education, and thinking about how are we making sure that they're all engaging in these deep inquiries in the classroom. And if you want to know what you can do from here, invite others to the conversation. If you remember our map, we have some states that haven't even started to explore with us in this conversation. So share the roadmap with your network, your colleagues, your friends. Go back to the website, explore the resources. I know we've put that link into the chat, and continue the dialogue. We'll have our next session in April 6th, and the National Constitution Center is going to be joining us in the conversation as we continue the conversation and think about the purposes and principles of the Constitution. And on that note, with 1 minute to spare, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Jen and Rachel, thank you for sharing your expertise. We truly appreciate the resources you've shared. And everyone, thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. As Jen said, whether you are on the couch in some comfortable clothes or you're still at school, we really appreciate you joining us in the conversation, taking the time to stop and think and engage in even more learning around the EAD roadmap. So thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.